One tweet was all it took to shake an entire nation. In less than a minute, a short message posted online transformed a complicated legal case in London into a headline-grabbing story of victory, accountability, and justice. Screens lit up across Pakistan as people read the same sentence again and again. 190 million paid. For many, it sounded like the end of a long corruption saga. For others, it felt too neat, too simple, too convenient. And for investigators who had been quietly watching the case develop behind closed doors, that tweet marked not the end of the story, but the moment when the real questions began. One tweet was all it took to shake an entire nation. In less than a minute, a short message posted online transformed a complicated legal case in London into a headline-grabbing story of victory, accountability, and justice. Screens lit up across Pakistan as people read the same sentence again and again. 190 million pounds paid. For many, it sounded like the end of a long corruption saga. For others, it felt too neat, too simple, too convenient. And for investigators who had been quietly watching the case develop behind closed doors, that tweet marked not the end of the story, but the moment when the real questions began. The man behind the announcement was Malik Riaz, a British-Pakistani billionaire property developer known for building massive real estate projects and cultivating influence at the highest levels of power. His tweet framed the payment as a settled matter, implying cooperation, closure, and compliance with UK authorities. Almost immediately, politicians in Pakistan began celebrating. Supporters hailed it as proof that accountability had finally arrived. News tickers repeated the figure, 190 million pounds, as if the number alone confirmed justice had been served. But missing from the excitement was a basic explanation. Where had this money really come from, and where was it actually going? To understand why the tweet raised so many red flags, it's important to understand what the UK authorities had been investigating. This was not a criminal trial with handcuffs and courtroom drama. It was a civil recovery case led by the National Crime Agency, using powers designed to seize assets suspected to be linked to unlawful activity without securing a criminal conviction. Quietly, methodically, investigators had traced money flows connected to expensive UK property, offshore companies, and politically exposed individuals. At the center of those inquiries was a luxury London mansion valued at tens of millions of pounds, an asset whose ownership history was anything but straightforward. Long before the tweet appeared, UK authorities had frozen approximately 140 million pounds held in British accounts connected to the case. These funds were effectively locked down while investigators examined their origin. At the same time, questions were swirling about how a high-value London property had changed hands under circumstances that appeared unusually convenient. On paper, everything looked legal. But timing, connections, and financial trails told a more complicated story, one that could not be explained in a single social media post. This is where the public narrative began to diverge sharply from the private reality. To the average observer, 190 million pounds paid sounded like money being returned to the public, perhaps even to Pakistan. But legally, civil recovery does not work that way. Funds seized in the UK do not automatically become compensation for another state. They are subject to agreements, negotiations, and legal frameworks that are rarely transparent. The tweet blurred those distinctions, turning a complex settlement into a symbol, and symbols are much easier to celebrate than facts. Behind the scenes, officials on both sides of the story understood that the settlement was unusual. Instead of flowing directly into public coffers, the money appeared connected to the resolution of a separate mega-fine imposed on Malik Riaz in Pakistan, a penalty large enough to threaten his entire business empire. That overlap raised an uncomfortable possibility. Had UK recovered funds been used to settle a private liability instead of addressing the original concerns that triggered the investigation? If true, it would mean the settlement solved a billionaire's problem without delivering true accountability. The speed of the public reaction stood in stark contrast to the years it had taken investigators to build their case. Financial investigations are slow by design. Money moves through shells, trusts, and jurisdictions designed to obscure ownership. Each document leads to another layer. Each account opens new questions. That process doesn't end with a tweet. It barely begins. Yet the online announcement effectively closed the conversation for many, framing the settlement as a victory before the public had a chance to understand what had really happened. For critics, the tweet felt like a carefully crafted narrative move, not a disclosure. It shifted focus away from frozen bank accounts, unresolved questions, and the original purpose of the investigation. It reframed a legal compromise as a moral triumph. In doing so, it also placed enormous pressure on institutions to stay silent, because challenging the story meant challenging a version of justice that millions had already accepted. What made the situation even more extraordinary was the geopolitical weight of the case. This was not just about one man or one property. It involved UK law enforcement powers, Pakistani political figures, offshore financial networks, and assets linked to political dynasties. By compressing all of that into a single line, £190 million, the tweet transformed a multi-layered investigation into a soundbite, effectively controlling the public conversation before it could unfold organically. As journalists, legal analysts, and former officials began to ask deeper questions, it became clear that the tweet was less an ending than an entry point. Why had the settlement been negotiated the way it was? Who approved its structure? Why did it appear to benefit private liabilities rather than public recovery? And, most importantly, how did a legal action designed to expose wrongdoing end up shielding powerful interests from deeper scrutiny? The first keynote of this story is not about money alone. It is about narrative power, about how complex legal realities can be overridden by simple announcements, about how accountability can be claimed without ever being fully explained, and about how, in modern corruption cases, the biggest victories are often declared long before the truth is understood. That tweet shocked Pakistan not because of what it revealed, but because of what it concealed.
As the noise from the tweet slowly faded, attention began to shift toward the asset that refused to disappear from the story. The London mansion that symbolized everything questionable about the deal. Sitting in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, the property was valued at around £50 million and represented a level of wealth far beyond ordinary commercial investment. On the surface, it was just another ultra-luxury home owned through corporate structures that are perfectly legal in the UK. But when investigators started examining its history, the timing of events became especially troubling. The sale of the mansion appeared to align closely with growing financial pressure elsewhere, including looming penalties and investigations overseas. To investigators, this raised a fundamental issue. Was the property genuinely sold at market value in an independent transaction, or was it quietly used as a financial tool to resolve problems behind closed doors? In corruption cases, assets often serve as bargaining chips long before the public ever hears about them. This is where the story moves from simple suspicion into dangerous territory. If a property connected to politically exposed figures was used to facilitate a settlement that benefited a private developer, then the purpose of civil recovery itself comes into question. These legal tools exist to protect the integrity of the financial system, not to quietly rebalance the losses of billionaires under legal fire elsewhere. Yet the public explanation never addressed this conflict directly. Meanwhile, official silence became deafening. UK authorities rarely comment in detail on ongoing or concluded civil recovery cases, citing confidentiality and legal constraints. That vacuum allowed speculation to flourish. Supporters of the settlement argued that recovering any money was better than endless litigation. Critics countered that the recovery was meaningless if it failed to return funds to the people or institutions harmed in the first place. Without transparency, both sides were arguing in the dark. As journalists dug deeper, another uncomfortable question emerged. Was the mansion even properly sold at all? Certain reports suggested the asset remained linked to the same network of interests, despite claims of a change of ownership. If true, that would undermine the entire premise of a clean financial break. In asset recovery, separation is key. When separation fails, accountability collapses with it. The issue wasn't legality alone, it was perception. A justice system relies not just on lawful outcomes, but on public confidence. When a case involving massive sums of money ends with unanswered questions and celebratory headlines, trust erodes. People start asking whether the law treats everyone equally or whether wealth can rewrite outcomes without ever stepping into a courtroom. This is what made the case explosive beyond legal circles. It wasn't only financial analysts or lawyers paying attention anymore. Ordinary citizens, already skeptical of elite accountability, saw a familiar pattern. Complex financial language used to obscure simple realities. Money moved, power remained intact, and responsibility became difficult to assign. What made things worse was the international dimension. Pakistan's political climate at the time was already volatile, with accusations of corruption shaping public debate. The suggestion that UK-recovered funds were indirectly used to settle a massive domestic fine turned a foreign legal case into a national controversy. Suddenly, a London property wasn't just a luxury asset. It was a symbol of how global financial systems can interact in ways that shield the powerful from consequences. Inside legal circles, another concern quietly grew. Civil recovery is designed as an alternative when criminal prosecution is difficult, but it is not meant to replace justice entirely. When settlements are structured in ways that appear to protect influential parties, they risk becoming tools of convenience rather than accountability. That fear lingered heavily over this case, especially as no detailed breakdown of the settlement was released to the public. The second keynote of this story is about assets and appearances, about how a single building can sit at the crossroads of law, politics, and public trust, and about how the absence of clear answers can be just as damaging as evidence of wrongdoing. The mansion did not just represent wealth. It represented unanswered questions that no tweet, no headline, and no press release could erase.
As pressure mounted for explanations, attention shifted from the visible assets to the invisible machinery that had made the entire arrangement possible. This was no longer just about a mansion or a headline figure. It was about the financial architecture that allows enormous sums to move quietly across borders without triggering public alarms. Offshore companies, layered accounts, nominee directors, and complex trust structures all began to surface in reporting, revealing how modern wealth can be engineered to travel while responsibility remains firmly in one place. Investigators understood that the most important evidence in cases like this rarely sits in plain sight. It lives in documents filed in distant jurisdictions, in companies that exist only on paper, and in banking arrangements designed to comply with the letter of the law while avoiding its spirit. These systems are not inherently illegal, but when combined with political exposure and unusual timing, they become powerful tools for obscuring reality. In this case, those tools appeared again and again, always technically compliant, always just out of reach. The money trail that attracted UK scrutiny did not point to a single transaction, but to a pattern. Funds moved through offshore entities before emerging in the UK property market, detached from clear explanations of origin. For investigators, this was enough to raise alarms. The UK's civil asset recovery framework exists precisely for such scenarios, where criminal prosecution may be too complex or politically sensitive, but where allowing assets to remain untouched would undermine the integrity of the financial system. What made this situation particularly sensitive was the scale involved. This was not a minor recovery or a quiet settlement. It was the largest civil recovery action ever publicly associated with the National Crime Agency. That alone should have demanded exceptional transparency. Instead, the details remained locked inside legal agreements the public would never see, making it impossible to independently assess whether justice had been served or merely declared. At the same time, reports emerged suggesting closed-door negotiations had taken place in London's most exclusive hotels. These were not formal court proceedings or public hearings, but private discussions attended by legal teams and intermediaries. In any high-stakes civil case, negotiation is normal. What troubled observers here was the lack of oversight and the apparent absence of consequences proportionate to the scale of the alleged concerns. When deals are struck quietly, accountability becomes difficult to track. For critics, the core issue was simple. Civil recovery is meant to remove the benefit of suspected wrongdoing, not to redistribute it in ways that solve unrelated problems. If recovered funds effectively helped settle a massive fine imposed elsewhere, then the process had failed its basic purpose. Instead of restoring public trust, it appeared to reinforce the idea that wealth can reroute justice into negotiation. This perception was made worse by the absence of prosecutions. No criminal trial followed. No detailed judicial reasoning was published. No individual stood in court to answer questions under oath. Legally, none of this was required. Civil recovery operates differently. But morally and politically, the silence felt heavy. In cases involving ordinary citizens, punishment is visible. In cases involving extreme wealth, outcomes often vanish into paperwork. As the story grew, it began exposing an uncomfortable reality about international cooperation. While UK authorities acted within their legal mandate, the consequences of their actions played out elsewhere, reshaping political narratives in Pakistan. A settlement framed as a triumph against corruption abroad was repackaged domestically as proof that powerful figures could resolve massive liabilities without personal consequence. The same deal carried two very different meanings depending on which audience was watching. This duality is one of the defining features of cross-border financial cases. Jurisdictions operate under different pressures, different incentives, and different levels of transparency. What satisfies one legal system may inflame another's public opinion. In this case, the lack of clarity allowed each side to tell their own version of events, none of them verifiable in full. Legal experts quietly warned that such outcomes carry long-term risks. When civil recovery becomes a substitute for accountability rather than a pathway to it, the deterrent effect disappears. Future actors learn an important lesson. Even if assets are frozen, even if headlines erupt, there may still be a negotiated exit that preserves both freedom and influence. That lesson can be far more dangerous than corruption itself. The third keynote of this story is about systems, not individuals. About how global finance, legal secrecy, and political sensitivity collide to create outcomes that feel legally correct but ethically incomplete. About how justice can pass through every required procedure and still leave the public unconvinced. And about how the most powerful protection in modern corruption cases is not force or intimidation, but complexity. By this stage, the question was no longer whether money had changed hands. That much was undisputed. The real question had become whether any system, no matter how sophisticated, could convincingly claim success while leaving so many doubts unresolved. And as those doubts spread, they began to touch not just the people involved, but the credibility of the institutions meant to guard against exactly this kind of outcome. Those doubts didn't stay contained within legal circles for long. Once the story broke into the wider media, it ignited a political chain reaction that neither government could fully control. In Pakistan, opposition figures seized on the case as proof of elite impunity, arguing that the settlement exposed a system where power negotiates while ordinary citizens face consequences. Parliamentary debates grew sharper, talk shows ran nightly breakdowns, and the £190 million figure became less a symbol of justice and more a symbol of unanswered questions. At the heart of the controversy was a troubling ambiguity. If the money recovered by UK authorities did not clearly return to public benefit, then who ultimately gained? That question proved politically toxic. Allegations surfaced that the settlement indirectly eased pressure on powerful figures at a crucial moment, reshaping domestic political outcomes. Whether intentional or not, the timing alone was enough to fuel suspicion. In politics, perception often matters more than proof, and this case provided fertile ground for doubt. As pressure intensified, institutions responded with carefully worded statements. UK agencies stressed that all actions were lawful, that civil recovery operates under strict legal frameworks, and that confidentiality prevents detailed disclosures. Pakistani officials, meanwhile, framed the outcome as a recovery victory, without fully explaining its mechanics. Each side defended its position, but neither side addressed the core concern eating away at public trust: transparency. The absence of a trial loomed large over everything. Trials create records, testimonies, cross-examinations, and judgments that can be scrutinized for decades. Settlements do not. They close doors rather than open them. In this case, the lack of a courtroom narrative meant there was no shared factual baseline. Supporters and critics interpreted the same outcome in completely different ways, with no definitive account to anchor the debate. This uncertainty had real consequences. Public confidence in accountability systems weakened further, reinforcing a belief that corruption is not defeated, only managed. For younger audiences especially, the message felt stark. Exposure does not guarantee consequences, and scale offers protection. The very tools designed to combat financial crime appeared, at least from the outside, to have delivered a workaround. International observers also took notice. Anti-corruption experts warned that cases like this risk undermining future cooperation. When settlements appear opaque or politically entangled, trust between jurisdictions suffers. Asset recovery relies heavily on goodwill and credibility. Once those erode, future investigations face resistance, skepticism, and legal roadblocks that can stall even well-founded cases. Inside Pakistan's turbulent political landscape, the scandal became part of a larger narrative about power, accountability, and governance. Protests, legal challenges, and political realignments followed, with the case cited again and again as evidence of double standards. While many factors contributed to the eventual fallout, the £190 million settlement stood out as a turning point, a moment where public anger coalesced around a single, emotionally charged symbol. Meanwhile, the central figure of the story, Malik Riaz, receded from public view. No trial, no conviction, no formal bar from future business. Legally untouched, yet permanently associated with one of the most controversial financial settlements in recent memory. His absence from the courtroom became part of the narrative itself, reinforcing the idea that wealth can absorb scandal without suffering final judgment. The fourth keynote of this story is about consequences that extend beyond law, about how unresolved financial cases can destabilize governments, reshape public trust, and linger long after headlines fade. It's about the difference between legal closure and moral closure, and how failing to achieve the latter can be more damaging than failing to achieve the former. By now, the £190 million was no longer just money. It was a question mark hanging over two systems at once, a reminder that corruption cases don't end when funds move or assets change status. They end only when the public believes the outcome makes sense. And in this case, belief was exactly what was missing. As investigations slowed and official silence settled in, the story did not truly end. It hardened into something more enduring, a case study in how power, law, and perception collide, and how sometimes the most destabilizing scandals aren't those proven in court, but those left permanently unresolved. And with that unresolved weight hanging in the air, the story finally circles back to the question that should have been simplest, yet proved impossible to answer. What does justice actually look like in cases involving extreme wealth and global power? By the end of the controversy, no one was debating whether £190 million was a large sum. Everyone agreed it was enormous. The real debate was whether its movement had achieved anything beyond closing files and calming institutions under pressure. For many observers, the case became a lesson in how modern accountability can be negotiated rather than enforced. Nothing in the process technically violated the law, yet almost every stage of it felt unsatisfying to those seeking clarity. The money was paid, but responsibility was never clearly assigned. Assets were frozen, but ownership questions lingered. Statements were issued, but explanations remained thin. It was a resolution without a reckoning. What troubled analysts most was the precedent. Civil recovery cases are meant to deter wrongdoing by signaling that illicit gains will not be protected, even when criminal convictions are difficult. But when recoveries are framed as quiet compromises, their deterrent power fades. Future actors see not a warning, but a roadmap. Negotiate, settle, and move on. In that sense, the damage of this case may not be measurable in money, but in the signal it sends. The public, too, absorbed a difficult lesson. Many had initially celebrated the settlement, trusting that institutions were acting in their interest. Over time, doubt replaced that optimism. Discussions shifted from money recovered to money redirected, from accountability achieved to accountability softened. Once trust cracks in this way, it is difficult to restore, not because people demand perfection, but because they expect honesty. There was also a broader moral dimension that refused to disappear. While billion-pound assets were being negotiated behind closed doors, ordinary people continued to face the full weight of the system for far smaller offenses. That contrast sharpened public frustration. Justice, people felt, was not blind. It was selective. And that perception, whether fair or not, has consequences far beyond any single case. In Pakistan, the aftershocks continued to influence political debate long after the initial headlines faded. The settlement became shorthand for elite protection, cited in speeches, court filings, and public protests. In the UK, questions lingered quietly within policy circles about whether greater transparency was needed in high-profile civil settlements. Yet, as time passed, urgency softened. Files were archived, officials moved on. Institutions rarely revisit cases that are legally closed, no matter how controversial they remain. Malik Riaz himself remained largely out of public view, a figure both central and strangely untouchable. His story did not end in a courtroom or prison, but in silence. A silence made possible by legal finality without public explanation. For supporters, that silence confirmed innocence. For critics, it confirmed everything else they feared about how power operates. This final keynote is about accountability in the modern world, not just whether it exists, but whether it convinces. In an age of global finance, offshore structures, and cross-border negotiations, justice can be achieved on paper while failing in principle. When that gap opens, it doesn't just damage one case. It reshapes how entire societies view the rule of law. The £190 million settlement will always be described as historic. It will be referenced in legal textbooks, policy discussions, and political arguments. But history will not remember it for its size alone. It will remember it as a moment when two governments declared closure, yet millions of people felt the story was left deliberately unfinished. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. In a system designed to deliver clear outcomes, ambiguity became the final verdict. Not guilty, not innocent, not accountable, just resolved. In the end, the deal didn't just shake two governments, it exposed the fragile line between justice and negotiation and how easily that line can be blurred when power, money, and silence meet. For deep investigations, untold truths, and true crime stories that go beyond headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the real story is always deeper.